Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Cultivate, the Evergreen podcast, where we discuss all kinds of things about ministry, the life of the church, and the life of the region. So today, my guest is my fellow Associate Executive Minister, Reverend Paul Schneider. Thank you for being here. You're the Associate Minister of Operations and Administration.
Absolutely.
And Innovation and Design. We love these double titles. And I wanted to just talk to you about a lot of different things, about your role, what you're doing in ministry, and beyond. So before we get into any of that, let's just start from the beginning and say, well, how did you get into this role?
Sure. So I had been in bivocational ministry before this. I was working half-time for a local congregation and then also working full-time, or frankly better than full-time, in a salaried position doing operations management for distribution companies. I worked for a couple of them up here. I worked for a couple of them down in California. And those were very fulfilling roles for me. I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed working with people, helping get the best out of them. I enjoyed the challenge. You know, no day was the same day twice, and that's kind of necessary for me. I get bored easily, so always looking for that kind of shift and so on. And then I really enjoyed kind of making things go and making them tick, figuring out what is the big picture, and then how do all those little details fit into the big picture in order to make something function really well. I had been in with a company for about 4.5 years. It was a great company. I probably would still be there, except that Clem retired. And Clem Winbush, Minister Clem Winbush, was the office administrator here at Evergreen for pretty much since the beginning, I think. But she was retiring, and I said, oh, you need someone who can run that office, someone who can handle all of the financial transactions, someone who can handle all of the details and make things go. Well, I can do that.
Right.
And I know Evergreen.
Yes.
And I'm a pastor. And so I went to Doug and I said, what do you think about me applying for this job? And he was like, oh, that'd be great.
Right. And this is great because I think that's what's really interesting about you is that you have these really this really diverse range of experiences, right? And it's almost like that unique range of experiences makes you perfect for this job, right? That you bring together this understanding of administration, of business, of the work of pastoring, a knowledge of the denomination, the local church, which is a very strange thing, right, from the outside, and you kind of bring it all together. Now, I want to get into this a bit because, both of us have been pastors for a while in our previous jobs, and no one likes admin, right? Like, I feel like everyone's like, oh, like admin, but I see in you like a genuine appreciation and love for administration, organization, and you hinted at it a bit before, but I was wondering if you could go a bit deeper into that. Like, what is it about administration, operations, like that really attracts you and draws you in?
So one of the things that I learned very quickly is that being part of a badly run organization is painful.
Right.
Whether that's a business, whether that's a church, and so I always appreciated when an organization that I was part of was run really well. And so when I kind of came into Evergreen, as I was going through seminary and so on, down in the Bay Area, what I saw was from afar was an organization that was really innovative and unique in its approach and was doing things well. And what I hoped that I could bring to the table as I came on board was maybe a way to do some things a little bit better, maybe a little bit more efficiently. I had run events been part of, I'll call it con culture, for a while, working with fan-run conventions and so on. And so I had an idea of what it took to put on something like the annual meeting, right? I'd been part of putting on an event like that year after year, seeing how things changed and how they stayed the same, that kind of thing. And so I hoped that I could bring some of that to the table and really get a good sense, I would say, of how I might be able to not just take what Evergreen had already done and replicate it, but take what Evergreen had already done and help it grow and change and even innovate a little.
Yeah, and so I think what is interesting is that when we can't organize well, when we can't be administered well, then we can't be released in the things that we're passionate about. And that's what's exciting about leadership and organization for me, is that how can we really like empower and move people to do what they're called to do. And I think that's the big attraction for administration operations for me, even though I don't feel like I'm good at the spreadsheets or like, necessarily like all the details. But when I keep that end goal in mind, I get more excited, I think.
One of the things that I, have experienced being part of a couple of different churches and so on is that it can get real easy for a church to pour energy into operations and administration. Yes. And when it's not being run well, it takes a lot in order to make it do very little. But as you improve those efficiencies, as you find better systems to work with, as you maybe update and change the way that you're doing things, a lot of times you can put a lot less energy into that, and that frees up energy for doing things that the church would really be excited about doing. It allows you to put energy into making changes, into updating, sometimes even into the very ordinary and boring things, but that actually make a huge difference, like upkeeping the grounds and so on. If everybody's bogged down with paperwork, nobody has time to sweep. But once you sweep, the place looks clean, and everybody wants to come into a clean place. And while not everything's about cleaning, obviously, I feel like that's a metaphor for kind of how things can go in the church.
Yeah, I'm curious what you would think, because I'm sure everyone would like, cleaner churches, like more organized. We'd like to be more efficient. Who wouldn't, right? But what do you feel like for the local church? What are some of the largest obstacles to making that actually happen, though?
So very often churches have systems that haven't been updated in years.
Right.
And if your church is still running on Windows 7 right. Or Windows 95, which there are churches out there that are. Power Church is a very common software, and I have nothing against Power Church. But if you're using a Power Church of 3 generations ago and not the current version, you're really hurting yourself. So some of these things that we can do, some of these updates that we can do, can actually greatly improve our efficiencies. Some of the operations software that's out there, Power Church, Servant Keeper, they are continuously updating. They're taking feedback from their customers and coming up with new and better ways to do things. And so if you're using the version that your church bought 10 or 15 years ago, and you're not paying attention to the updates and the changes, then even if it's an updating software that updates automatically, you're still trying to use it the way that it was meant to be used 10 years ago, and you're not paying attention to the functionality that it has now.
Yeah, when I use that word update, like in my leadership circles, like people get like, I don't know, this phobia or like an allergic reaction, right? What do you feel like, what is the barrier for people updating?
Especially in churches, a lot of the barrier to updating is that people don't have the groundwork already done in the first place. So the procedures, the employee handbooks, the manuals, the policies, they're just not already there. But here's the thing, once they're there, it's easy to tweak them. It's easy to update them. It's easy to adapt them. So part of what I am actually here to help churches do is to implement those policies, those procedures, those operational guidelines that are best practices, recognized across denominations, across churches, to really help churches stop putting all this energy into trying to remember how something was done 15 years ago that was never written down, and instead develop a policy that they can follow from now on, and then update as they need to when it's appropriate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I feel like a lot of places they don't have a protocol of like how to update, right? Like if there was an actual track or if there was a procedure or some method to say like, okay, well, every X number of amount of time, we're going to assess like, is there something new out? Can we shift? And if we just made these little incremental changes throughout time, it would have been a lot easier. But like you're saying, there are these churches like, oh, we haven't changed anything for the past couple of decades. Like making that shift every 20 years is much harder. But if you could make these little smaller baby steps along the way, it's a lot less threatening, right?
In the operations management work that I did in the secular world before, I did a lot of efficiency. I'm a Six Sigma certified yellow belt. I worked with ISO 2001 and 2014, certified companies and that kind of thing. And so that idea of continuous improvement, of making sure that not only is a procedure documented, but that it's being reviewed, that you're updating the ways that things are moving forward, that when you're running into problems, you're paying attention to how the problems are affecting you and those kinds of changes. That's just part of the mindset that I bring to this. And a lot of churches don't do that. They're so used to one person having a role and having it forever that they just kind of rely on that person's memory. But what happens when that person leaves the organization, voluntarily or involuntarily, right? I mean, then you're really kind of caught in a difficult situation. In Evergreen, we kind of are facing some of that challenge now, where Doug, who's been with us for just over 6 years, closing in on 7 years, is the longest term staff member. The rest of us have all been here for just over 2 years now in my case, not quite 2 years in yours, just over 2 years in Siobhan's case. So the institutional memory of how stuff got done has kind of gone. And we're finding those areas where, this just used to be something that lived inside, a previous employee's head.
Yeah, that's a great point because, I like that phrase, like institutional memory, because what a lot of churches, because they're relying on volunteers and, there's nothing keeping them. It's not like a professional contract or anything. We rely on institutional memory so much. And institutional memory it doesn't update well, right? It doesn't keep improving or move. It's just very static. But if we could move to these processes, right, that are not dependent on the individual and their particular skills, we kind of make it easier to recruit, bring in people, get them on board, and then also get other new people on board. Because a lot of churches, you just get that same treasurer for 50 years or something, right?
Right.
Because we're just relying solely on institutional memory and not on sound procedures.
And one of the things that really happens when you do that, when you have the same people filling your leadership positions, even if there's some measure of rotation where they're maybe swapping out who's the moderator and who's the treasurer and that kind of thing, is that you're not training your next generation of leadership. And so one of the things that's actually really important that most churches don't have, even the church I was in until very recently didn't have this, is thorough policies and procedures for each position on the board. Right. What does the moderator do? What are they actually responsible for? There's there's a paragraph in the bylaws maybe, but not more than that. Right. So then what does it take to run a meeting? How do we do that? Yeah. What's our procedure? And nothing says that procedure can't be changed, but if you're going to change it, you should at least know what it was. And when it's just living inside people's heads, again, that's super hard to update. You just, and that's the other thing is that when it's written down, the question of, well, that's the way we did it before. And you can say, okay, that's good, but now we're going to do it this way. When you don't have it written down and everybody just assumes that's the way things are done, then that can be, you get a lot more pushback, right? Because no, this is the way it has to be done. This is how church works. Lots of churches do it differently.
Right. Yeah, that's true. So you have a very unique vantage point because you get to see all the churches of the region. Like a lot of pastors don't have your perspective. And this is putting you on the spot a bit, but if you could think of like one innovative practice for church organizations, what would you want them to do? If there's like one thing that really sticks out that you're seeing as a common theme throughout the region, like this is something, if I could tell you to work on anything this year, I'd like you to work on this.
So one of the things that has been true of all of the churches that I've done administrative reviews of is that the rental agreements, the lease agreements, were maybe not as robust as they could be, right? Or that there were inconsistencies in them, where one lease agreement would be fully documented and completely, and then another one would be a couple of sheets of paper, right? And those are the kinds of things that actually protect both the church and the tenant. Those agreements are what are going to allow you, when there's a problem, and there will be a problem eventually, that's actually how you're going to resolve it. You're going to go back to the agreement and you're going to look and say, well, who has the authority? Where do we come down on this? And also, where can we compromise, right? And so that would be one thing. And maybe it's not super innovative, but it is the kind of thing that when those problems crop up, you're then not having major headaches. There's not as much grief. There's not as much stress. There's not as much difficulty. It's the same thing as an employee handbook, right? It spells out the expectations nice and clearly so that everybody involved knows what the agreement actually is. And then there's a lot less subjectivity of interpretation about what was agreed to.
Yeah, and I like what you're saying because when you have like this template agreement, like you kind of figure out like what are our values of who we get to rent, what are we doing, how much, how do we get there? If you understand that, like any future tenants, like these are our standard practices, and it makes it a lot easier rather than just like creating a completely new agreement each time, right? And so I think that is innovative because that sets you up for the future, and it gives you an integrity to all your tenants in the present. I wanted to kind of shift before we kind of close up, but I would definitely be remiss if I didn't talk about, I want to go back to your original statements at the beginning of the podcast where you're talking about your love of organizing, bringing people together, making spaces. Tell us more about your project outside of Evergreen that you're doing in the con world.
Sure. So my other major ministry besides my work with Evergreen is called the Oasis Project. And the Oasis Project is a nonprofit, or soon-to-be nonprofit, organization that creates what I call Oasis rooms at conventions, conferences, and festivals. So an Oasis room is a space that you can enter. It's a low sensory space. It's staffed by an interfaith team of clergy, and you can step away from the hustle and bustle of the convention and move into this space that is lit differently, that's quieter, and that has a bunch of tools for you to be able to either distract yourself or refocus, meditate if you need to, seek spiritual guidance if you need to. That's why the interfaith team of clergy. All of these things help people who get overwhelmed by conventions, and boy, is that easy to do, kind of recenter themselves. And then if they really need something significant, the Oasis team can be that first point of contact. And if it becomes something that is kind of beyond our ability to handle, we can bring in the convention staff, we can bring in necessary authorities and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I love how you integrate all parts of your life. Like even now, we're filming live in your studio. In your office. The studio we've set up here is in your office. And your love of science fiction, fantasy, pop culture is even here on the bookshelf. I was just wondering if maybe you could kind of identify there's some fun things here on your shelf even.
So I'm a big fan of science fiction. One of my favorite shows, like many people, was Firefly, which didn't last long enough. And so when they put out the movie Serenity, they released a series of comics that kind of told how different members of the crew ended up on board the ship. And one of the characters I always identified most with in that show, of course, was Shepherd Book, who was the wandering pastor, right? So I have here a copy of The Shepherd's Tale. And then above that, you can kind of see the Shepherd Book statue that I have, still in its box because, so some things are important. And then actually on the wall, there's a blown up picture of from The Shepherd's Tale that is him just getting ready to step out into the world, leaving the Abbey, doing what's next. And my ex-wife gave that to me when I graduated from seminary. That was my graduation gift from her. So, it's one of those reminders that part of what I'm doing is stepping out into the world and trying to make it a better place just by going out and being part of it.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, you're doing a doctoral ministry as well, integrating pop culture, theology, interconnection, and outreach.
Pop culture are the meaning-making stories that our culture tells itself about who we are and what we do. The church has a good news, exciting news to share with the world. But the standard that we used to share that with, the biblical stories, are not the stories that our culture is the most familiar with anymore. So there are ways for us to use pop culture to communicate our gospel message to the world. And I'm looking at developing ways to help churches do that better.
Yeah, no, that's great. I wanted to bring this all into interview because I feel like this is all very consistent with who you are, and what you're doing is that your love of administration, of organization, the work that you're doing with the Oasis Project, just your interest in pop culture. It's all about like organizing spaces for interaction, for love and dreams to happen. And it only happens if you make a good space for it, right? Those things can't thrive, those conversations can't happen if we don't organize well. So I appreciate how you do that in many different ways, in many different facets. And I'm looking forward to what's to come. So thanks for being with us on the episode.
Glad to be here.
Tune in next time, and we hope you subscribe, and more episodes are on the way. Talk to you soon. Bye.